So today we're going to cover the basics of online fundraising with an emphasis on smaller organizations, because a lot of the things that work for big campaigns and big organizations, don't work as well for folks that don't have 500,000 followers on Facebook or 1 million people on your email list. So just a little quick background about me. I've been working with Rob Vandermark since probably 15, 16 years ago. We were staff at National Environmental Trust together. Before that, I was a political staffer in Texas. I started doing political technology in the late 90s. Since 2006, I've been running epolitics.com, where a rotating cast of us writes about digital politics and advocacy and how to do it. I'm a digital strategy consultant, working with a lot of different nonprofits and a few businesses in the political space as well. And then I am personally an advocate for most of the issues we work on. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Oh yeah, I also, every election cycle, I update my guide to digital politics. This is my, this is the 2016 version. The new one, I hope I will finish by next week. So let's talk fundraising. So what works? Well, the first question is, we've got to ask, what works for whom? Because we are not that guy, right? We are not Barack Obama. We're not Donald Trump. We are not Save the Children, right? A lot of the things that people see and ask about in the digital fundraising world are things that they see that are maybe not applicable to their own situations. So the first things you've got to ask yourself are, what kind of an organization are we? What are our strengths? What kind of grassroots support do we have? What kind of brass top support do we have? What are realistic expectations for digital fundraising? That being said, organizations of any size can benefit from handling donations online, particularly because it's just a lot easier for somebody to give money via the internet than it is to write a physical check like we did in the old days. So simply having the basics of a fundraising program, just a donate button, that can be at least a start. And then from there, we can get into the more sophisticated topics. But what works in a broad sense are a handful of things. One is emotion, right? People rarely give money based on a cold calculation. Now, maybe when they were deciding which presidential campaign to donate to a couple of weeks ago, they might have. But when they're deciding whether to donate to our nonprofits and advocacy organization, it almost always comes back to something that, some kind of emotional reaction that pushes them over the top. Another thing that tends to work is this long-term demonstration of value, right? People want to see that their money is going to a good cause, but they also want to make sure it's not wasted. And they're often very sensitive to things like matching grants because, one, it's validation, but two, it also suggests their money is going to go farther. The third thing is we have to ask. Folks in the nonprofit sector, now it is different now than it was 15 or 20 years ago, I think, but some folks in the nonprofit sector are still a little reluctant to just come out and baldly ask for money. The thing is, if you don't ask, you're probably not going to get it. And then the third thing I'll point to is, or fourth thing is email consistently. Now we'll talk about texting, we'll talk about social media, but if you need to get people to do something, to take an action, and fundraise or making a donation is almost always the highest bar action they're going to do for you, you're probably asking them via email. And I'll talk about why in a minute. But just keep in mind, emotion, long-term demonstration of value, making the ask, and then you're probably doing it via email. And I'll point out on this long-term demonstration of value, every contact that a potential donor has with your organization or your staff potentially affects their desire to donate or not. So your social media content, your email content, if you do conference calls for activists or volunteers, how those go and how they see those. All these perceptions that people gain of our organizations through our communication stream, they affect our fundraising. So it's not just the fundraising message. I like to think that we're managing relationships on a large scale when we're doing digital advocacy and fundraising. I'll just point out that the rules are a little different for institutions versus individual people. If you're raising money for a cause through your own social circles, your own social networks, you're going to use everything that you have. If you're raising money from for an organization, you're going to use the tools available for an organization. So one of the things we try to do is use those organizational tools to try to get our individual supporters to get active in their social circles. And we'll definitely talk about that. So individual, every channel you got. So how do you make the appeal? You make it personal whenever you can. People like to see their name. And most of the mass email systems that we use in the business these days, names like Action Network, which we use for the Marine Fish Conservation Network, Every Action, Salsa, there are a zillion of them. Almost all of them have some ability to personalize messages. Dear Bob, right? And then, you know, when you get more sophisticated, you start referring to actions people have taken. We know you're passionate about XYZ issue because you took an action on it 6 months ago. That's called list segmentation, and we'll talk about that later. Another thing you can do is make it visceral. Tell stories from the field. You know, one of the strengths of the network's approach over the last few years has been our blog, which is elevating voices directly from the waterfront. You know, fishing guys, commercial fishermen, chefs, people who are deeply, deeply involved in that world, and it gives us credibility, right? You know, these folks know what they're talking about. Similarly, you know, stories from your own work or people touched by your own work can show, not tell, the good work you're doing. Feature volunteers, for instance. As you'll see, if you open your inbox, you get any kind of political mail, dire consequences. Dire consequences do tend to get people to open their wallets. Unfortunately, we sometimes have to resort to fear to get good work done. But the thing is that if you hit the dire consequences too often, you risk, you know, being the boy who called wolf and turning people off. So as we'll discuss when we're talking about stats, measuring statistics, everything's a give and take here. But be sure to ask and be sure to emote, right? There is a reason that the wildlife organizations that can feature photos of charismatic megafauna tend to do really well on fundraising. And again, groups that work with children. I worked with Save the Children in the fall. Groups that work with children also frequently see really high, you know, comparatively high levels of activation for their emails. Basically, a lot of people are going to respond. Just think about ways that you can make the ask and appeal to people's hopes, to their desires, to their fears, unfortunately, to somehow make them, you know, cross that hurdle and pull out their credit card and give you money. Let's talk about tailoring the appeal. Often we're just watching what our audience likes, what are they reading on our blog, what emails are they opening, what web pages are they going to. If you're running your own email list, you can look at the messages that your folks have responded to. You know, if you're a multi-issue organization like most of us, like for instance, I used to work at National Women's Law Center, and our fundraising emails around women's reproductive rights and women's health performed a lot better than our also really good work around Social Security and the social safety net. People had that emotional response to the reproductive issues, so that's what they gave money for. So that's what we tended to hit. Testing can help. When I talk about testing, we'll talk about it a little bit more, but you can try different messages. If you have a big list, you can break it into chunks. Almost any mass email program will do this. It's called A/B testing. Break it into chunks and send one message to one group and one message to another group, maybe hitting different issues in this case, and see which ones they respond to. So basically, yeah, you're trying to get the appeal in front of your typical internet user like this, that user is going to go for, that activist is really going to make. And like I said, testing and looking through your data, basically when people open your messages, they're telling you what they like. So if they consistently open one kind of message versus another, that gives you a big. So what's in a fundraising plan? Let's talk fundraising plan. And if you have questions, we're definitely going to have time at the end for that. So hold on to them. I mean, you need to have your goals, obviously. We need to, and they might not just be monetary. They might be goals like, we need 1,000 new donors this quarter, or we need to raise our average donation from $5 to $10, that kind of. But setting hard goals, this is what we're working toward. Integration, this is how your fundraising fits with all the other pieces of your outreach. Is your website ready for the influx of traffic? Does your website reflect the priorities in your fundraising campaign? Are you ready to put content out on social media as well as just email? And you want to be looking at the individual messages, the actual content. And here, the subject line is by far the most important piece of content, as we'll talk about. But so even as you're planning your overall fundraising program out, already be thinking about the content. Visuals you want to have lined up in advance. Good photos, compelling photos make a huge difference, and you don't want to scramble for them at the last minute. Landing pages. So a landing page is where you go when you click on a link. When you click on a link in an email that says go here to donate, or if you click on an online ad, or if you click on a Facebook page or a tweet. Basically, it's where you go to take action. And we'll show some examples in a little bit. You want to have your schedule in the plan, and you want to have a big ending. It always helps to, well, not always, but it generally helps to build to something. And then any extras, like, for instance, we're going to need messages for our supporters to send out on our behalf. Just all the little details. You want to try to work that into the plan so you don't get caught at the last second. So I talked about the big ending. A lot of times, especially you'll see this with fundraising before a deadline. With political campaigns, it's often end of quarter deadlines. For just about everybody, it's year end. And I just want to point out that most nonprofits raise the bulk of their money in year end fundraising. And often they raise a huge chunk of it just between Christmas and New Year's. So build toward that big ending. You can, start with early messages that, yes, you want people to donate via, but you're really making the case and then building toward these last chance to, for your tax deductible gift to matter in 2020 kind of language. So you understand that again, each message has a little tension because it needs to stand alone, but it's part of that art. But at the same time, just because you have a plan doesn't mean that you're not prepared to take advantage of things. If you go back to 2008, the single biggest day of political giving up to that point was to the Obama campaign right after Sarah Palin gave her convention acceptance speech to be vice president. And Obama supporters flooded to his website to give him money. Within minutes, within an hour or two, his campaign had messages out the door. They probably should have had them ready, but they were able to strike while the iron is hot. So if something happens, if something breaks that elevates your issue, be ready to jump on it, even if it's not in your plan. So let's talk fundraising emails. Subject line, obviously. The sender is important. You'll see a lot of different approaches from organizations and campaigns. For small groups that aren't sending as often, I think consistency is more important than anything else. Visuals, if you use them, although we're seeing fewer and fewer photographs and things like that in fundraising emails now, and I think that's largely because they're being opened so often on mobile phones, that anything that gets in the way of someone getting to the link, can actually cut your response rate. The intro line, also important because it's the first thing people see when they open the message, but in a lot of email programs, it shows up as in the preview window. So it also functions like the subject line in enticing you to make the click. Signature, you want your message to come from a person. So sincerely, thank you from the bottom of my heart, blah, 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 executive director. Any backup text that you need between the intro line and the signature. And if I sound dismissive to most of the text, it's because in the nonprofit world, we tend to lard these things up with lots and lots and lots of text that actually gets in the way of somebody taking the action. The single most important piece of content in the whole message is the subject line, because the subject line tells someone whether they want to click on that or not. And when people talk about doing A/B testing, often they're testing, the main thing they're testing is subject lines to see which one gets open. You can also, though, get more sophisticated and test which subject line yields more donations, not just clicks, or yields a higher amount per donation, that kind of thing. And then I always put a little PS at the bottom of my fundraising messages. This hard experience has shown that people do click on those. So if I'm writing a fundraising message, I usually have, you need a look at me subject line, a hook 'em first line, then you get to the first donation, stop them right now, give us money, link, bold, standalone. Then I'll have another one a little further down, and then I'll have another link in the footer. But that subject line, there's some people who say you should spend 2/3 of your time on the subject line and the other third on the rest of the message. That's a little exaggerated, but it gives an idea of the relative importance. So here's a good example. This is from, I believe, Ultraviolet a few years ago. Yeah. You'll note they have a nice button that stands out. I'll chip in 75. This is from 2 or 3 years ago. Their messages now tend to have the links more in the body of the message. But you'll see, Colin, we wanted to make sure you saw this email from the other day. It's getting an amazing response. If they're resending a message that was working well for them. Basically, their data told them that this message was working well, but I had not clicked on it yet, right? So they were able to segment their list to target people who had not taken action on this and resend the message. The only hassle is I forgot to get the subject line of this one, so that will always be a mystery. But this gives you a sense. And notice how short the text is. Notice the use of bolding. And then, yes, I'll chip in $75. I mean, that's a lot of chipping in, but, and you'll notice they also have a very specific ask, right? They're talking about an affordable way to buy advertising in airports to target state legislators. So that is a very specific ask, but it had a good theory of change behind it, right? The idea that here's a cost-effective way to reach these legislators and put pressure on them in front of their own constituents. So, landing pages. Now, this one is from the National Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee. I included it because it is so clean. Look at this. There aren't extraneous links there. So, you have your faded visual in the background that doesn't really interfere. Text is short and simple. And then you ask, in this case, it's a petition signature, it's list building. But they're asking for the minimum information, making it as easy as possible for someone to take the ask. A lot of times people will recommend having fundraising pages that don't have links to anywhere else in the site, because it can be a little hard to pull off unless, depending on how your site is set up. I would just urge simplicity on the landing page. But yes, few distractions as possible. And I'll show this in a second. Echo the messaging from what you sent out. If they're coming from a Facebook post that talked about cats, featured cats on the landing page. Echo the ask amount, like that $75 from Ultraviolet. That would be on the page when I went to it. Include validation information. If you have a Charity Navigator or Guide Star or a Better Business Bureau little certification, you can put little graphics on the donation pages, and it reassures people. Another thing that reassures people is testimonials, right? So if you are going to have a visual, I think a big photo and a pull quote from someone about how great your work is, that's the kind of thing you can put on there. But make it as easy as possible. I test things on my mom. If she can take an action online, anyone can. So find a naive observer, we like to call them, somebody who's not familiar with your site, and tell them, go online and give me a donation and see if they can do it. If they can't do it easily, you've got a problem. So here's another example of a nonprofit landing page. Again, we've got a compelling photograph, donate now in big bright colors. You notice down to the bottom right-hand corner, meet our latest donors. That's a great way of validating. Look, these people are giving money, you should too. Now, here's an example of how content from an ad ties into the landing page itself. So this was from 2016. This was a petition signature campaign. Basically, it's just an email list building campaign. So step one, build list. Step two, ask list for money, right? So if I clicked on that, sign me up, I went to a page that looked like this. Let's go back, look at that photo. Hey, same photo, same colors, right? Okay, you're like, maybe their whole website looked like that. No, if you went to the main Hillary website that same day, their default donate page looked like that. So from there to there. This one, the one where she's wearing the red, that matches the content. This one probably matches everything else they're doing. And I'm sure that they have A/B tested every single one of these. But so you can see, you know, this just is one of these rules of thumb. Try to make the content match as you're going. So a frequent question, how much is too much? If you're sending too often, how do you know? Because people leave your email list. If people stop opening your messages, if they start unsubscribing, you're probably doing something wrong. If you have a big list, you know, it would be time for some testing. If you have a small list, and these are people you're regularly in communication with, I would just, you know, reach out to some of them and see, hey, are we sending too much? I think in the current political campaign or climate, people are much more used to a high volume of emails. I mean, some of these campaigns are sending 4 or 5 a day. So you're talking 100, 200 messages a month. For a typical nonprofit, that's more like 1 or 2 messages a month, most of which would not be fundraisers. The others might be an action alert or your e-newsletter. But watch your open rates, your action rates, and your unsubscribe rates. And again, these are measured in any mass email system, Action Network, Every Action, or commercial things like Constant Contact and MailChimp. So if you have any questions, you can ask me, but you can also Google, how do I find XYZ in, say, MailChimp, and you'll usually find something. I've been finding a ton of really good tutorials on pretty obscure topics on YouTube lately. So, but you can always just ask me too, and I'll give you whatever advice I can. But yeah, so, you know, these are the most important statistics to watch: your open rate, the actual action rate, i.e., they sign the petition or they make the donation, and then your unsubscribe rate. If people are marking you as spam, you have a serious problem. And yeah, that is not to be trifled with. You should be talking to your email provider at that point to see what they recommend. The donor match programs, we've touched on these so far. Crowd validation. If you ever have a chance to include a, you know, your money will be doubled kind of ask or matching ask, do so. Frequently, you know, sometimes people make them up. I don't recommend that. But frequently what happens is they'll approach one of their big donors and who is going to give a donation anyway and ask if they could use that donation as a match. In other words, you know, not necessarily say that person's name, but just say, thanks to a generous benefactor, you know, we're able to match this twofold. Like I said earlier, it gives people more bang for the buck. It gives you validation. And it's one of those tactics that just consistently seems to do well. This is a Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee message from a couple of years ago. You will see things that look just like this pretty much coming from the DSC right now. Let's just say that the donor matches get used up and down. There is no evidence that triple matches or quadruple matches outperform double matches. So there's no need to go crazy on it. The party committees like these, they kind of have to go crazy because, you know, they're not constantly hyping things. They're not even going to get noticed. So small donor programs. So this is, you know, how a lot of grassroots organizations think, you know, Democracy for America are able to fund themselves. The thing with grassroots donations is that it really does take an enormous amount of volume to add up to much. I think that there are a lot of reasons to do them that aren't even financial. Like, for instance, once someone has donated to your organization, they're literally invested. It has deepened their connection to you. So even if someone's only given $5, they're still, one thinks more likely to do whatever else you ask them to do later. But a good email response rate, a good response rate to a fundraising email is typically in the 1/10 or 2/10 of 1%. So if I send to 1,000 people and one or two of them donate, that's pretty good, right? So that tells you right away just how much of a volume game this is. If you have 1,000-person list, I don't say don't fundraise, but I would say calibrate your expectations. But the thing to do from there, and we'll talk a little bit more about list building in a minute, is expanding your base, right? How can you think about how to reach into new audiences? And then once you connect with people, how do you move them up the ladder of engagement, right? How do you get them, for instance, you just get them in the door with that petition signature. And then you ask them to take an advocacy action, or an email Congress or tell your legislator sort of action. And you ask for money. You try to give people opportunities to walk themselves up the ladder of engagement so that somebody goes from a casually interested person to someone who's going to be passionate and give you time, money, or both. And then that is what all of our communications really ultimately come to, right? We're in the advocacy or fundraising world, is how do we get people to do something? And, all the tricks I was talking about earlier, show value, because they're not tricks, they're substantive, right? Show value, build an emotional connection, and give people a reason to get involved. So here's an example of how you can take a simple action and try to get more out of it. This is a paid petition that ran on Care2, right, care2.org. So if I'm a nonprofit organization, I can pay Care2 X amount of money, and they will, based on, they know how their community performs, they'll put that petition in front of their community and guarantee you a certain number of petition signatures, which means the same as signups to your email list. This is the thank you page for someone who took that action, right? So this group had an action around red wolves. So I've signed their petition, and now I land on a page that's trying to get me to donate. So theoretically, this is the moment that I would be most interested in donating. I just took an action. I'm primed. So you can run a petition campaign, but still try to get the idea of donating in people's minds and see if you can get some of that iron that is struck when it is not. So another frequent question is social media fundraising. The short version is it's complicated, right? Because most of us are not this guy. Most of us are not Trump. There are a couple of different ways that organizations raise money. One thing you can do is simply post a fundraising appeal directly to Facebook. Unfortunately, those typically don't work terribly well. The way Facebook's content algorithm goes, if people don't immediately like and share something, it's very hard for it to be seen. And fundraising asks just typically don't get liked and shared much. We often have to pay money to boost them to our audience in the hopes that someone will take action on it, right? You can do native Facebook fundraising. We set the network up for that in the fall. So basically you can put a little donate button on all of your Facebook posts. It's a little bit of a pain to set up, but it wasn't too bad. They just have some hoops you have to jump through to make sure that the money that they're raising is actually going to the nonprofit organization it's supposed to be going to. So that to me is reasonable and good due diligence. Again, when organizations post themselves, it often doesn't do that well. What seems to be working much better on Facebook is getting people to fundraise on your behalf, getting your supporters. And I'm sure you've all seen this. XYZ has donated his or her birthday to raise money for whatever the cause is. So asking supporters to donate their birthdays. You could ask them, via your email system to pledge to, you could say, basically send out an email, hey, pledge your birthday to us and we'll remind you. And then you could send them, and you'll get their birthday. And then when when their birthday pops up, you send them an email saying, hey, remember when you said you wanted to donate your birthday to our organization? Well, it's time. This is a great example of integrating the pieces. The actual action will take place on Facebook, but you're using email to get that person to do it. And you're using your mass email database to keep track of that person. So just want to point out, it does sometimes work. When Trump announced the first travel ban against majority Muslim countries, ACLU raised an insane amount of money on social media over the weekend. They had a lot of celebrities jump on board and spread the word, but just a ton of individual citizens did as well. They raised more money in a weekend than they typically raised in a year. So every now and then it can happen. So you want your website to be ready for that, just in case you're the group that happens to do well. Now, Trump used Facebook big time for fundraising in 2016. His was the first presidential campaign, the first campaign to really crack the nut on that. I'd like to point out that they connected with people on Facebook. They used, I'm happy to go into it on another occasion, but they used data targeting and testing on a huge scale to connect with potential supporters across the country. But once they were connected, once they were brought on board, it's email that actually raised the money. And to this day, the Republican Party is still raising a lot of money from the email addresses that Trump collected back in 2016. And his campaign is going to be doing the same thing again in even a more sophisticated way. But like I said at the beginning, we are not them. Most of us are face a very different social universe, where by far the best thing we can do is to get people who support us speaking up for us. So there was a 2014 study. This is a cool one. I was afraid I was going to skip it. There are ways to connect Facebook and email. I can upload a list of email addresses, so I can upload my supporters to Facebook. And Facebook tries to match them to people on Facebook. And you can use that as an ad targeting universe. So what that meant in 2014, and people have replicated this since, several campaigns would send out a fundraising message. Then half the people who got that fundraising message, they would target with Facebook ads echoing the theme of the fundraising message. And then they would follow up with a similar message 2 or 3 days later. The upshot was that the group that saw the Facebook advertising gave more money, and they gave more than enough to pay for the advertising. So there's a tiny example of how, you're raising the money on Facebook. You're raising the money via email, but you're using Facebook to prime people for that content. And, we don't have to be so formal about it. Like I mentioned earlier, everything you put out there on social, every interaction someone has with your organization, those things prime them for donating. So think about your social content as, how can I show value to my supporters? Or how can I engage them intellectually, sure, but also emotionally? So we're getting toward the end here. So let's talk about how we can segment our lists. So segmentation, it sounds like super fancy. It's pretty well built into, like I said, most of the email advocacy systems that we have access to. A common thing is to target people who have taken a particular action. If I took a Tell Congress action around Save the Whales, you might send me a thank you just because I took that, with a fundraising ask attached to it, right? But there are a lot of other ways you can list segment. Interests, I've talked about this a good bit, what people have shown that they care about in the past, but also demographics. Frequently, for us, this is really geographics. You can send tailored appeals to people in different states with language that reflects that state, for instance. All of this is time consuming, as you can imagine. So the only time you really segment a list is when you have a good reason to segment a list, i.e., I think that sending one message to part of our list and another message to another part of our list is going to raise more money. And then you can test that hypothesis and see if it worked. But don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but it is possible to split a list to send people different messages or only send messages to some of them. But you go down a data hole fast. You can very quickly get into this micro-targeting world. Micro-targeting is a very hyped word. Basically, the more you segment your list, the more content you have to create. Because if you're segmenting the list, it's because you think they're going to respond to different content. So you can go down a hole very fast. But okay, so let's talk A/B testing real quick. It is science. It is being built into these systems more and more. And actually, if you buy Facebook advertising nowadays, A/B testing is built into Facebook's ad interface. Not the boost button, but if you use the advertise on Facebook in the upper right drop down, basically the more sophisticated ad interface, Facebook has A/B testing across a lot of different variables baked into it. But here's the basic concept. Now, this is an example of A/B testing a color on a landing page, right? So in this case, 50% saw orange, 50% saw green, and orange converted more. So what do? We change the page that everyone sees to orange. This basic approach applies to email subject lines. It applies to senders in emails. It applies to that opening line I talked about. People with big lists will do things like test the colors of the donate button, right? For small lists, can't really get enough data, right? A/B testing doesn't really work unless you have thousands of people on your list, because you need to be sending a message out to thousands of people to get enough responses. So just bear in mind, testing can be very powerful, but you have to have big enough sample sizes for it to be meaningful. And you have to have something meaningful to test. You have to have a real belief that, you know, this subject line has a potential to outperform another subject line. People can go down a hole on testing just like they can with segmentation. So I try to typically keep it very practically focused. So implementation tips, we're wrapping up here. Subject lines again. Beware the policy wonk editor's pen. This has been a real issue at a couple of nonprofits I've worked in or with, where the policy people will create a very simple, straightforward fundraising email, and the policy people send it back with, 10-syllable words and footnotes. So remember, we don't include everything we possibly could in a fundraising message. We're really trying to get someone to take that one action that day. So boiling it down, keeping it tight. It can be tough with policy folks who are like, oh, this isn't quite nuanced enough. But, fundraising isn't so much about nuance, it's about emotion. Like I mentioned earlier, have your visuals ready in advance, and then be prepared to pivot, right? Strike while the iron is hot. So big question, again, all the time, is list building. For small organizations, I think in person, as you're doing events, just get everyone's email address that you can and then contact afterward and see if they want to get on your list. Social media, especially if you can get other organizations to ally with you and you amplify each other's content, right? I'll share yours, you share mine kind of thing. And of course, you can do paid outreach on social media. It's really a question for another day, but I'm always happy to chat about that. Paid petitions like Care2. Peace.org used to use these. They've de-emphasized their business, so I send people to Care2 these days. The nice thing about those is that they are generally, they're very predictable when it comes to cost. Care2 will say, you give us $80,000 and we will get you, 60,000 names in the place you need them or whatever it is. So it's very predictable. You can use paid gathering on Facebook as well. I've showed a couple of petitions like that. Frequently, then you're using what's called a Facebook lead generation ad. And those can be competitive with Care2 petitions. So these are, again, paid ways to grow your list. But you can also, if you're allied organizations, You can do, we call them list swaps, but it's not really a swap. I'm not sending you my list and you're not sending me yours. If you tried that, it probably wouldn't go very well because most of your messages would go to spam very quickly. But what you can do is I'll send a message to my list on behalf of your organization. You send a message to your list on behalf of mine. Or we do a joint action. We have a petition, we both promote it heavily, and we share the volunteers or the activists who come in through that. These list swaps can be extremely cost effective because really the only cost is typically time. A lot of organizations, smaller ones especially, have found them to be really useful. One thing I would point out is you need a partner if you're going to do something like this for a joint action or something. You want to partner with someone who has a list that are similar in interests, but they don't overlap a ton. If you've got a 1,000,000-person list and someone else has a 1,000-person list, well, guess who's going to get a lot more out of a swap in that case, right? So just I would approach it carefully. I have several articles on my ePolitics site about list swaps if you're interested that I could send over. But like I said, you're not giving anyone your email list. You're just figuring out ways that each of your lists can help a partner organization. So thank you guys. We're right at the 3:50 mark. Not bad at all. So this is me. Why don't we go ahead and go to questions? Like I said, I'm very happy to chat with anyone about these topics. I've been doing this stuff for a long time, and I'm very, very interested in them. I love chatting about internet politics and advocacy. So, questions, you guys? You have to unmute.
Hi, this is Teresa Labriola. I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, all the way back at the beginning. So you're talking about a fundraising plan, and in that you talk about the schedule. And I wasn't sure if that schedule is something that you have to have your schedule internal, or if that's something that's good to share. And I was thinking about it. It's sort of like, could it be part of your narrative? So, hey, we have this thing coming up. Support us now. So I wasn't sure which way the schedule went, or if it goes both ways.
Oh, that's great. I had not honestly thought about sharing the schedule. So to me, it's an internal thing. But if you can find a way to work it into your narrative that makes everything compelling, sure. That sounds like a clever, creative approach.
Wonderful. You could use it in your next webinar.
Yeah, but no, it's typically like, we're going to send this message on this day, this message on this day. So you across the hall who needs to write this message, here's what it needs to be written by. So that's more typically what I'm thinking about.
Yeah.
But
I find that our organizations often has a difficult time with that last message, which is like, we had a great win, now it's time to support us. But if it was part of a series like, hey, we're going to this meeting and this is what we're working on and support us, that would be great. Hey, we went to that meeting, we won, thanks for your support, pass it on. So
yeah, and I'm a big fan of here's what you let us do, or here's what you helped us do. And this is, again, I think something that frequently falls short in the nonprofit world is, we ask and we ask and we ask, but we never say we won, or thank God, look what happened. Maybe we just don't win enough. We're here to change that. So any other questions?
I have one.
Yeah.
My name is Vicki, and I run the Inland Ocean Coalition. And we have a database that we are outgrowing. And would you have any databases you recommend where we could actually incorporate action alerts and other types of communications? Right now we use Network for Good, and it isn't quite doing it for us.
Yeah, I hear you. I have two defaults these days, and network related properties are using both of them. The one that is very affordable is called Action Network. It's designed for small organizations, but it worked well, and the AFL-CIO adopted it as their in-house advocacy tool set. And so the AFL is supporting its continued development. So this thing is getting more and more robust by the day. It's really good, especially for smaller organizations. It doesn't have quite as many bells and whistles. Your actions, typically you have to put them on your own website. They don't host so well on the Action Network site itself. And by say put on your own, I mean embed the action. So there are a couple little technical steps you have to do sometimes. And I would also point that none of these systems is as intuitive as it needs to be. They have all driven me to rage and frustration before. So just bear in mind. So the other one to take a good look at is called Every Action. It's a little newer. It's been around like 6 or 7 years, but it derives from technology that was used by political campaigns for years. If you've done grassroots democratic politics, you might have heard of NGP Van. So this took the NGP Van tool set. They spun it into a separate entity that works with nonprofits. And they're starting to capture people from some of the older legacy platforms. Every action is very powerful. Again, the user interface can be a little non-intuitive, but those to me, they're very different price points. Action Network's really cheap. Every action is going to get more expensive the bigger your database, as these things typically happen. But I'd be very happy to connect you with folks at either one. I've got friends at both.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
Let's see, any other questions? Well, all right, everyone. I just want to thank you all for making it today. Like I said, I'm very passionate about these things. I love getting a chance to share the opportunities here, but also to share the cautionary tales that we need clear goals, good content, compelling emotional connection. But the money is out there to be tapped. The supporters are out there to be tapped. The trick is finding the right message at the right time to reach them. So thanks again, and we'll send around the link to the recording. Once I get it down, I'll probably have to edit out the very beginning where I think we had technical problems, and we'll go from there. And again, I'm very happy to chat anytime if you have questions about this. So thanks again, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you for your time.